Hey guys, Shinry here, back with another video. Once again, this video is sponsored by me, the author of the Shinry series and the Chronicles of Wayne, and we'll get into that at the end of the video. For now, I want to talk to you about one way to write a magic or power system. So I talked about this briefly in the Dragon Ball Z video, the Tower of God effect, but I want to give you my example of how I do it. It starts with opponent tier, home tier, city tier, multi-city tier, planetary, continent tier, planetary, multi-planetary, or god tier, and it ends there. And the reason why you want to do this for your story, to figure out like your power system, is because you want to make it make sense when your characters are getting stronger, as well as the opponents being stronger than them, or the opponents being weaker than them over time. And one good example that I'm going to reference for this is Pokemon. We all know Pokemon: Fire, Water, Grass, the original three. Charmander, Squirtle, or Bulbasaur. Now, you know, if you played red, blue, or yellow back in the day, in the early 90s, if you started with Charmander, your Charmander was stronger than Bulbasaur, but weak to Squirtle. But that Charmander could still beat that Squirtle. It's just going to take a lot of shaking his butt in front of his face with that tail whip and then scratching it over and over again. Same for Squirtle. Squirtle can easily beat Charmander, but he's weak to Bulbasaur. But he can still beat that Bulbasaur with a bunch of defense curls and a few bubbles. Eventually Bulbasaur goes down. Bulbasaur easily defeats that level 5 Squirtle, but it's going to struggle against that Charmander. But you know, with a little bit of paralysis poison seed, and razor leaf, that Charmander will go down. So it's a way to make your characters relevant, but still either struggle or have an advantage over another opponent. And so that's what we're going to get into. So let's get into it. So this is an example of creating a balanced power system. It starts with opponent tier, then home tier, city tier, multi-city tier, continent tier, planetary, which is usually how the story ends, and then multi-planetary or god. We're going to get into more detail right now about it, starting with opponent tier. So let's go ahead and get into it. Opponent tier is being able to beat an opponent or evenly fight against another character on the same or slightly higher level. This generally happens in the beginning of the escape. A character will face an opponent slightly stronger than him or evenly matched, usually like their rival. He can win or lose against this opponent because it's usually like just to help him get stronger over time or just to challenge him on and off throughout the story. Characters at this level, they aren't OP and they're not necessarily weak, but they aren't lifting or destroying buildings, but doing bodily damage to each other. Think of like Ichigo versus Renji. You know, they were evenly matched. Renji was slightly stronger, but then, you know, Ichigo reaches down deep, digs in. Naruto versus Sasuke, their first initial fight, pretty evenly matched. Not like the one in the mountain, but like, you know, just like randomly fighting each other as kids. Luffy versus Zoro. In the beginning, Luffy is slightly stronger than Zoro because he's the main character, but Zoro, you know, he does have Luffy's weakness being a sword. And so let's move on to the next one, guys. Now, home tier gets a little bit more complicated. It's when an opponent or character has the ability to destroy a building at top power. Now, opponent's tier or normal human being cannot destroy a building. You're not lifting a building, you're not destroying a building at normal levels. And even the strongest human in the world probably can't destroy a building with like one punch. It's not going to happen. So home tiers are usually what I create for opponents to be like subplot antagonists, like, you know, or minor antagonists to face along the way. It leads up to the climax, but it's not usually the final climax villain. Unless your story is like really, really grounded. Which, I mean, it can be, but like, again, I write high fantasy. I want to say if you're writing, let's say, grounded stories, like just normal human beings, there could be maybe a human that can destroy a building, like, you know, fully powered, maxed out. And then you would need like 3 opponent tiers, 3 normal humans to take down that one guy. But these characters are generally, they can level buildings at their highest peak, making them strong enough for your opponent tier or your main character to level up throughout the story. They are always stronger than your main character to challenge them and push them to new heights, abilities, and levels. It's how your character gets like the Rasengan over time. It's how Luffy gets the Gear 2nd, Gear 3rd. It's how Ichigo gets the Hollow Mask and Getsuga Tensho. You know, these characters and enemies, antagonists, usually push your characters to reach a new level, reach a new height. It's Deku doing the I don't know, 100% smash or whatever it's called. Sorry, I don't really remember. It's Asta realizing he has anti-magic, stuff like that. So yeah, this is usually the next tier that the characters face throughout the quest, but not generally in the climax. Not generally. Now, city tier are usually what the characters face in the climax. This is like when you're not at your end of your trilogy, or maybe this is just like one book. These are like the villain that's going to destroy the city. Or the villain, if you're in a high fantasy manga, that can destroy a city with max power. They're usually in the first number of your books as antagonists. And you can use them multiple times. Like, you don't have to go immediately past city tier villains, city tier antagonists in your second or third book. You can make it, unless it's a trilogy, you can keep them at that level, you know what I mean? But they are usually the first number of antagonists in the book, and eventually the protagonist will reach these heights too. Your climax is always the hype of your book, the apex villain that your main character struggles to defeat. They normally can level cities at their highest peak, and they would have to be, at least in my opinion, for high fantasy. The main character, even if he could defeat a home tier, can never do this job on his own and relies on 2 other opponent tiers or 1 home tier to help him. What I mean by that is, I don't want your main character to take down a city. I don't want your opponent tier level main character to take down a city tier villain. I don't want him to defeat the villain on his own. I want you to use those side characters to help him take down that city tier. And I would say maybe like 5 opponent tiers against 1 city tier, or either 2 opponent tiers and 1 home tier to take down a city tier. Just keeping your story balanced. Like, you don't literally have to call them home tier and city tier, but you know what your characters are capable of. And I wouldn't say don't make your hero a home tier just yet, like be able to destroy a building just yet, even by the end of your story. Maybe like in a sequel, but definitely he can still take down. He can be the one that takes down the city tier main villain, but just don't make him too overpowered too quickly, if you know what I mean. Unless you're writing high fantasy. If you're writing high fantasy, anime characters, they can reach that home tier level, pretty fast, Next up, we have multi-city tier. They're powerhouses that at max power can destroy multiple cities or areas at once. A multi-city tier is generally a character who at this point might be at the end of your trilogy. This is like after your first, second, and third, you're going into your third book. And, he's fought like 2 city tiers already. Your main character, he could possibly be city tier by the trilogy or at the end of your high fantasy. And by now, your character is just under half of this multi-city tier level villain. Like, I don't want to spoil my own books, but this is where my characters usually get like a secret training. They go to an alternate world. They get a power buff to challenge this opponent. Think of Ichigo going into the Garancha to fight Aizen. Think of Naruto doing his Sage Mode training to take on Pain. Think of Luffy getting trained to do Haki. This is where you power up your opponents. You power up your main character to get them to this ending trilogy level. Not where they are above the villain, but like they can do bodily damage to this multi-city level villain and be able to give them a challenge. But they will still need help from maybe 2 city tiers, maybe 1 city tier, multiple home tiers, multiple opponent tiers if he's got friends with them. And, he eventually takes them down. And this is normally where most books and series end, unless you're writing a long series. Or, again, if you're writing a multiple high fantasy series or trilogy, we can still kind of go past this. This could also be your second book level villain if your character took down the city tier villain in the first book pretty easily or almost very easily. This can get him to that next height through some secret training and stuff like that, and then we can get into like the higher levels past this. Now, continent tier is kind of where we start getting the crazy power levels. This is where your story is reaching get near the end of your series, but not quite yet. At max power, they can obliterate an entire island or continent. Also, opponent tier and home tiers are knocked out in one blow. Like, if you have any side characters that are still opponent tier or still home tier, they're just getting knocked out by one attack. Like, they stand no chance at this level. By now, usually you're in the later part of your series. For me, this is like book 6 or 7, where my opponents can easily level cities. Oh, well, my main characters can easily level cities at max power. That's because my main character has reached that level where he can just destroy a city at like with ease. But it's still good enough to make an opponent for this to be way out of their league and require extra training or more help. I prefer to think of this as scaling in a series. If the antagonist does not always stay above the protagonist, most of the time, there's no threat to worry about. That's why I think I like Dragon Ball Z's Tower of God effect. Since Goku is already above Planetary, it means every villain he has to fight has to be above Planetary. They have to be able to destroy planets. And that's ridiculous because, like, all these new characters can't just already be Planetary, but they have to be because our main character's at that level. And that's the problem with, like, the Tower of God effect. But I understand, but we love Dragon Ball Z. Again, we don't hate Dragon Ball Z here. But it's just, you are reaching heights where it's hard to make an opponent be way stronger than Goku. It's hard to make like Pain being above Naruto made sense because, you know, Naruto, even with Sage Mode, was getting defeated, but then he unlocked Kurama, or Eight Tails Kurama. You know, Gear 4th Luffy was losing against the Emperors until he realized he had Gear 5th. You know, Ichigo, even with his Hollow Mask, was losing against Ukouria until he went full Hollow form. So that's what I mean. You always keep your antagonist above your main character, but don't make it too ridiculous before your series ends. So having a continent tier knock out opponent tiers and home tiers in one blow makes sense. It keeps it relative, you know what I mean? So let's move on to the next one. Next up, we have Planetary. This is usually where I make the highest antagonist or protagonist go. Anything further is going into a ridiculous realm, and I'm going to get into that in a second. But Planetary tier is usually the peak of the antagonist or protagonist. Usually I say just end it with the antagonist being this strong. I do believe that multiplanetary or God tier can exist in a world like this or be referenced. But honestly, if your character or antagonist is at this level, it may as well be your final book. There's no reason to go beyond this. There's no more scale or growth to make any book go any higher. Or if you do go the route of God tier, it's usually because no one deserves that much power, so they're easily defeated, or like you have to defeat them because no one deserves that power. All the same, I've used God tier, but it's always at the end of a series. So Planetary was Frieza, pretty much after Frieza, everybody was Planetary. But most series don't usually get to that until the end of the series. Like Madara, at the end of Naruto, was Planetary. Aizen was pretty much Planetary. It was the end of Bleach, sort of. Or he was like continent tier at best. I'm going to give Aizen Planetary, but he was continent at best. If at lowest. One Piece, we haven't got to Planetary. We're definitely Island Destroyers. One Piece has not gotten that crazy yet. But Island Destroyers, because we know how big islands are on One Piece, that is a huge deal. Black Clover, we fought Luciferio, who I want to say was Planetary, or definitely continent tier, because our latest villain is definitely Planetary, which is why Black Clover's reaching its end anyway. But yeah, this is usually where your book ends in a high fantasy series, because once you get to Planetary, you can keep villains at Planetary, because maybe your protagonist hasn't got to that level, but once your protagonist reaches Planetary level, able to destroy a planet at max power, you might as well end the series. But there is one final version you can go to, which we're going to get into now. And the very last thing you can do, guys, is multiplanetary or God tier. This is normally referenced in the universe, but never used or shown until the very end of your series. If you have to use multiplanetary or God tier, just end your series. So I briefly mentioned God tier when I was explaining Planetary, but this time I'm going to full detail. The reason why God tier is a problem for scale and storytelling is the peak an antagonist or protagonist can go. The threat can't get any bigger than multiplanetary or God tier. So there's two ways to go about this. It's at the end of your series, your character has transformed into the ultimate hero, or if it's an antagonist, the antagonist that it's used for, it's used against them. Like the power is too overwhelming and it rejects them, or like it's too overwhelming and so your character overfeeds them with power and they explode. You know what I mean? It's usually like resetting a universe, or it's just like, hey, we have to take down this god, or your character becomes a god tier by killing this character, and then at that point there's no one your character can't defeat. And so that's why multi-planetary god tier isn't really used. It is used in anime like Zeno and Dragon Ball Z. Kaguya is not god tier. I don't consider that. I don't consider those aliens god tier. Yeah, I mean, I guess Yak was kind of god tier because he's able to see multiple futures at once. And, you know, One Piece, they're hinting at this villain that might have god tier powers, but we don't know who he is yet. Miyu or Nemu, but we'll see. But yeah, that's pretty much the end of my scaling list. If you guys have any questions, just write down in the comments below. Planetary, multi-planetary, opponent tier, home tier, and what your question is about it, and I can try to help you with it and answer some questions. Other than that, guys, we're going to wrap up the video right here. This video, once again, is sponsored by the Shinry series. You can find all of my books listed here on Amazon.com, either by going on my page, Terrence Shinry Johnson, and follow the link to all my books, or feel free to just follow the link tree. It'll also link you to all the books that are available right now. Love Be Damned and Love Be Caged are listed for $6.99, and the first book in the Shinry series is listed for $9.99. Called Shobu Samurai Project Aryoku, as well as the other books on there. Shobu vs. Shinry, The Sword of Light, listed for, I believe, $14.99. And then Enter the Dread Zone Part 1 and Part 2, listed for $7.99 and $6.99, respectively. Either way, I appreciate and thank you for the support. Hope to see you guys again.